Martinez had always believed her 23rd birthday would be ordinary. Working double shifts at the downtown hospital as a night nurse, she never imagined that walking home through the abandoned warehouse district would change her life forever. The fog rolled in thick that October evening, swallowing the streetlights and muffling her footsteps against the cracked pavement. She first noticed him in the shadows between two crumbling buildings. Tall, impossibly beautiful, with dark hair that seemed to absorb the moonlight and pale skin that glowed like marble. His eyes were the color of fresh blood, and when they locked onto hers, felt her breath catch in her throat. This was Adrian, though she wouldn't learn his name until much later. For 3 centuries, he had ruled the vampire covens of the Eastern Territories with an iron fist, feared and respected by creatures of the night across continents. Tried to run, but her legs felt like lead. Adrian moved with inhuman speed, appearing before her in the blink of an eye. His cold fingers traced her jawline as she trembled, unable to scream or move. There was something hypnotic about his presence, something that made her mind feel clouded and distant. He tilted her head back, exposing the pulse point at her neck where her blood rushed frantically beneath her skin. When his fangs pierced her throat, the pain was sharp and immediate, followed by a strange euphoria that made her vision blur. Felt her strength draining away as Adrian drank deeply, his grip tightening around her waist. She could hear her own heartbeat growing fainter, could feel the warmth leaving her body. This was how she would die, she realized with surprising calmness, drained dry by a monster in a forgotten alley. But then Adrian stopped. He pulled back abruptly, his expression shifting from hunger to disgust, collapsed to the ground, gasping and clutching her wounded neck. Blood seeped between her fingers as she watched Adrian wipe his mouth with the back of his hand, his beautiful features twisted in revulsion. "Worthless," he spat, his voice carrying centuries of authority and contempt. "Your blood is weak, tainted. I have tasted beggars with more strength in their veins." Couldn't understand what he meant, but the rejection stung worse than the bite itself. She had been found wanting by a creature she didn't even understand existed. Adrian circled her like a predator, deciding whether his prey was worth finishing off. "You carry fear like a disease," he continued, his red eyes gleaming with disdain. "Your spirit is already broken before I even touched you. What use is such pathetic sustenance to one of my standing?" He crouched beside her, grabbing her chin roughly and forcing her to meet his gaze. "I have drunk from warriors and queens, from those whose hearts burned with passion and purpose. You are nothing but a frightened little mouse." The Vampire King stood and adjusted his expensive black coat, clearly preparing to leave. "Consider yourself fortunate," he said without looking back at. "I have killed thousands for far less than wasting my time. Your worthless blood has saved your miserable life tonight." His laughter echoed off the warehouse walls as he vanished into the darkness, moving so quickly that wondered if she had imagined the entire encounter. Lay on the cold concrete for what felt like hours, her hand pressed against the wounds on her neck. The bleeding had slowed but hadn't stopped completely. She felt weak and disoriented, her thoughts jumbled and strange. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound made her jump. Somehow she managed to stumble home to her small apartment, where she spent the next 3 days in bed, calling in sick to work and trying to convince herself it had all been a nightmare. But the bite marks on her neck told a different story. They were already beginning to heal, forming 2 small puncture scars that would never completely fade. More disturbing were the changes began to notice in herself. Her senses seemed sharper, sounds more distinct, colors more vivid. She could hear conversations through walls that should have been too thick for sound to penetrate. The smell of blood at the hospital, which had never bothered her before, now made her mouth water in a way that terrified her. Tried to research what had happened to her, spending hours online reading about vampires and supernatural encounters. Most of what she found seemed like fantasy and folklore, but some accounts matched her experience too closely for comfort. She learned that vampire bites could sometimes leave humans changed, caught between mortal and immortal states. The medical term was syndrome, though the scientific community dismissed it as psychological trauma manifesting in physical symptoms. Weeks passed and gradually returned to her normal routine, though she never felt entirely normal again. She avoided the warehouse district and started taking different routes home from work. The night shift, which she had always preferred, now filled her with anxiety. Every shadow could hide a predator, every stranger might have fangs hidden behind their smile. Her began to notice her changed behavior. Sarah, her closest friend at the hospital, cornered her one night during their break. "What happened to you?" Sarah asked, concern evident in her voice. "You used to be fearless, working these late shifts, walking home alone. Now you jump at every little sound." Wanted to tell her the truth, but who would believe such a story? Instead, she made excuses about stress and overwork, promises to get more rest and maybe see a therapist. Sarah wasn't convinced, but she didn't push the matter further. Appreciated her friend's discretion, even as she felt increasingly isolated by her secret. The dreams started about a month after the encounter. Every night found herself back in that alley, but the scenario played out differently each time. Sometimes Adrian drained her completely, leaving her a withered corpse in the shadows. Other times, he transformed her into something like himself, though she always woke before understanding what that meant. Most disturbing were the dreams where she fought back, where some hidden strength allowed her to resist his supernatural power. Began to wonder if Adrian had been wrong about her blood, if there was something he hadn't recognized or understood. The changes she experienced suggested that his bite had affected her more profoundly than either of them had realized. She started paying attention to her body in new ways, noticing how quickly small cuts healed, how her night vision had improved, how she could sense things about people just by being near them. One evening, while walking to work through the safer, well-lit streets she now preferred, felt someone watching her. She turned to see a figure standing beneath a streetlight half a block behind her. Even at that distance, she could make out pale skin and dark clothing that reminded her uncomfortably of Adrian. Her heart began to race as she quickened her pace, but when she looked back again, the figure was gone. This became a pattern over the following weeks. Would catch glimpses of someone following her, always just at the edge of her vision, always disappearing when she tried to get a better look. She began to suspect that Adrian was having her watched, though she couldn't understand why. If her blood had been so worthless to him, why would he care what happened to her now? The answer came on a rainy Thursday night in late November. Was leaving the hospital after a particularly difficult shift when she noticed the footsteps behind her, matching her pace perfectly. She ducked into an all-night diner and ordered coffee, hoping her pursuer would give up and leave. But when she looked out the window, she saw him clearly for the first time. He was tall and lean, with platinum blonde hair and eyes so pale they seemed almost white. His features were sharp and aristocratic, and he moved with the same inhuman grace she remembered from Adrian. This was clearly another vampire, but something about his presence felt different. Where Adrian had radiated cold authority and barely contained violence, this stranger seemed more controlled, more calculating. Finished her coffee and left the diner, no longer trying to hide the fact that she knew she was being followed. The vampire made no attempt at concealment now, walking openly about 20 feet behind her. When she reached the corner where she usually turned toward her apartment, she stopped and faced him directly. "What do you want?" she called out, surprising herself with her own boldness. The vampire smiled, revealing just a hint of fang, and began walking toward her. Stood her ground, though every instinct screamed at her to run. "You are much braver than Adrian led me to believe," the stranger said when he was close enough that they could speak normally. His accent was faint but noticeable, possibly European. "My name is, and I have been very curious about you, Martinez." The fact that he knew her name sent chills down spine, but she refused to show fear. "How do you know who I am?" she demanded. "And what does Adrian have to do with this?" Smile widened. "Adrian has ruled our kind in this region for centuries, but his arrogance has always been his weakness. When he dismissed you so contemptuously, he made a grave error in judgment. You see, I have been watching you since that night, studying the changes in you, and I believe you possess something far more valuable than Adrian realized." Felt a chill that had nothing to do with the November air. "I don't understand what you're talking about," she said, though part of her suspected that wasn't entirely true. The dreams, the enhanced senses, the way she seemed to recover so quickly from Adrian's attack, all of it suggested that something significant had changed within her. "Your blood may have tasted weak to Adrian because he doesn't understand what true strength looks like," continued, circling her slowly like Adrian had done, but with none of the predatory menace. "He sees only surface power, the kind that comes from fear and aggression. But you have something much rarer. You have the capacity for growth, for transformation. Adrian's bite didn't weaken you, it awakened something that was already there." Before could respond, moved with vampire speed, appearing behind her and placing one cold hand on her shoulder. "I would very much like to test my theory," he whispered in her ear. "But unlike Adrian, I believe in earning loyalty rather than taking it by force. The choice, for now, remains yours." Turned to face him, her heart pounding but her resolve strengthening. "What kind of choice?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. His pale eyes gleamed with something that might have been approval. The choice to discover what you truly are, he replied. And perhaps in doing so to show Adrian that his judgment is not as infallible as he believes. Spent 3 sleepless nights thinking about Soffer. She researched everything she could find about vampire rivalries and territorial disputes, though most sources seemed unreliable. What she did learn suggested that the supernatural world operated under complex rules of power and hierarchy that mortals rarely understood. Wasn't just another vampire, he was Adrian's equal, possibly even his superior in some ways. On the 4th night made her decision. She returned to the diner where had first approached her and waited. He appeared exactly at midnight, sliding into the booth across from her as if he had been expected. "I want to understand what's happening to me," said without preamble. "But I won't be anyone's pawn or experiment. If you want my cooperation, I need to know exactly what you're proposing." Nodded approvingly. "Direct and intelligent, I can work with that." He folded his hands on the table between them. "What I'm proposing is a bond, not the crude dominance that Adrian attempted, but a true partnership. I will share my strength with you, help you develop whatever abilities Adrian's bite awakened, and in return, you will help me understand why your blood affected him so strangely." Studied his pale features, looking for signs of deception. "What kind of bond, and what makes you think I have abilities worth developing?" "The kind of bond that has been forbidden between our species for over 1,000 years, replied quietly. "A blood bond that creates equality rather than servitude. As for your abilities, you've already begun to manifest them, haven't you? Enhanced senses, rapid healing, dreams that feel more like visions than mere nightmares." His breath caught. She hadn't mentioned the dreams to anyone. "How do you know about that?" "Because I've been alive for 800 years, and I've seen what happens when someone with latent supernatural heritage is bitten by a vampire of Adrian's power." Leaned forward slightly. "Your grandmother was Roma, wasn't she? From the old bloodlines that once served as mediators between the human and supernatural worlds." Stared at him in shock. Her grandmother had died when was 12, but she remembered the old woman's strange stories about spirits and magic, tales that her parents had dismissed as folklore. "How could you possibly know that?" "Because your blood carries the echo of old magic. That's why Adrian found it distasteful. He spent so many centuries feeding on pure human blood that he's forgotten what power really tastes like. Your heritage makes you naturally resistant to vampire domination, which is why his attempt to hypnotize you was only partially successful." The pieces began to fall into place in his mind. Her grandmother's strange abilities that the family had attributed to superstition, her own intuition about people that had made her such a good nurse, the way she had always felt slightly out of step with the purely mundane world. "What would this bond actually involve?" she asked. Reached across the table and placed his hand palm up between them. "A mutual exchange of blood, freely given. I will share my supernatural strength and knowledge with you, while you share your natural magical resistance and insight with me. We become partners in truth, each gaining what the other possesses." Stared at his outstretched hand. "And if I refuse?" "Then you walk away, and I never approach you again. But your abilities will continue to develop whether you accept my help or not. Adrian's bite has started a process that cannot be stopped. The question is whether you want to learn to control what's happening to you or let it control you." Thought about the past month, about feeling lost and frightened, about the changes in her body and mind that she didn't understand. She thought about Adrian's contempt, his dismissal of her as worthless. Most of all, she thought about the dreams where she fought back, where she was strong enough to stand against creatures like him. She placed her hand in his skin was cold but not unpleasantly so. "What do I need to do?" Smile was genuine for the first time since she'd met him. "Trust me, and let me show you what you really are." The bonding ritual took place in his home, a restored Victorian mansion on the outskirts of the city. Was surprised by how normal it looked inside. Expensive but comfortable furniture, artwork on the walls, a library filled with both ancient texts and modern books. It was nothing like the gothic horror she had expected from vampire stories. "The bond requires privacy and concentration," explained as he led her to a study lined with books in languages she couldn't identify. "And it must be done at the moment when your natural defenses are lowest, which for someone of your heritage means during the dark moon." Settled into a comfortable chair as lit candles around the room. "Will it hurt?" she asked. "Less than what Adrian did to you," replied. "The pain comes from fighting the connection. If you accept it willingly, it should feel more like completion." He sat across from her and took her hands again. I need you to lower your mental barriers. Think of the most peaceful moment you can remember, something that makes you feel safe and centered. Closed her eyes and thought of her grandmother's kitchen, the smell of herbs and baking bread, the feeling of being completely accepted and understood. She felt presence in her mind, gentle and respectful, nothing like the forceful intrusion she had experienced with Adrian. When bit his own wrist and offered it to her, didn't hesitate. His blood tasted nothing like she had expected, not metallic or unpleasant, but warm and somehow familiar. As she drank, she felt strength flowing into her, not just physical but mental and spiritual strength. Her senses expanded beyond anything she had experienced before. Then bit her wrist gently, and as he drank her blood, felt their minds truly connecting. She could sense his thoughts, his memories, his genuine respect for her and desire for partnership rather than domination. The exchange lasted only minutes, but when it was over, felt fundamentally changed. How do you feel? Asked, his voice slightly strained from the effort of maintaining such a delicate mental connection. Stood and stretched, marveling at how different her body felt. She was stronger, faster, more aware of everything around her. But unlike the disorienting changes after Adrian's attack, this felt natural, like she was finally becoming who she was always meant to be. Complete, she said, echoing his earlier word. Like I've been walking around half asleep my entire life and now I'm finally awake. Nodded, the bond will continue to strengthen over time. You'll develop abilities that pure vampires don't possess, while I gain access to the magical resistance that has protected your bloodline for generations. But there's something you need to understand about what we've just done. What? Asked, though she suspected she already knew from the serious expression on his face. We've just declared war on Adrian. The moment he senses the change in you, he'll know that I've bonded with someone he considered his property. His pride will demand retaliation, and he won't care that he rejected you first. Felt a surge of anger at the word property, but it was followed immediately by fierce determination. Let him come, she said. I'm not the same frightened woman he left bleeding in that alley. I'm not his property, and I never was. Smiled and could see both approval and anticipation in his pale eyes. No, you're not. You're something far more dangerous to him. You're his equal now, and he'll never be able to accept that. Over the following weeks, trained in abilities she was still learning to possess, she discovered she could move with supernatural speed, though not quite as fast as a pure vampire. Her strength was formidable but came with a precision and control that admitted he. Most importantly, she retained her resistance to vampire mind control, meaning that even Adrian would not be able to hypnotize or compel her again. Your mixed heritage creates unique advantages, explained during one of their training sessions. Pure vampires are powerful but limited by their nature. You have options we don't, ways of thinking and acting that centuries have closed off to us. Learn to fight, to hunt, to use her enhanced senses to navigate the supernatural world that existed parallel to human society. But she also retained her humanity in ways that surprised. She continued working at the hospital, using her new abilities to help her patients in ways she never could have before. She could sense illness and pain with unprecedented accuracy, could comfort the dying in ways that seemed almost miraculous to her colleagues. You're becoming something new, told her one evening as they watched the city from the roof of his mansion. Not quite human, not quite vampire, but something that incorporates the best of both natures. Nodded, feeling the truth of his words. She was stronger than she had ever been, but she was also more compassionate, more connected to life rather than death. The bond with had awakened not just supernatural power, but a deeper understanding of who she was meant to be. That understanding would be tested sooner than either of them expected. Adrian had been watching them, of course. He had sources throughout the supernatural community, vampires and other creatures who reported to him out of fear or loyalty. Word of transformation reached him within days of the bonding, and his response was swift and violent. The first sign of trouble came when friend Sarah disappeared. Arrived at work to find the hospital in chaos, security guards interviewing staff and police taking statements. Sarah had been working the late shift when she simply vanished, leaving behind only her badge and a pool of blood in the supply closet. Knew immediately who was responsible. Her enhanced senses could detect Adrian's scent lingering in the hospital, faint but unmistakable. He had taken Sarah to send a message, to demonstrate that new power couldn't protect the people she cared about. He's baiting you, warned when told him what had happened. Adrian wants you angry and reckless. If you go charging after Sarah, you'll be playing his game by his rules. But was beyond caring about strategy. Sarah had been her closest friend for 3 years, had covered for her when she was struggling to understand her changes, had never asked questions she couldn't answer, would not abandon her to whatever Adrian had planned. Then we'll have to change the rules, replied, her voice steady despite the rage burning inside her. You said I'm not bound by vampire limitations. Let's find out what that really means. Studied her face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Very well, but if we're going to challenge Adrian directly, we need to be smart about it. He's had 3 centuries to perfect his cruelty, and he won't hesitate to kill Sarah just to hurt you. Felt her new abilities crystallizing into cold determination. Adrian had dismissed her as worthless once before, had left her bleeding and broken because he couldn't recognize her true nature. He was about to learn that his contempt had been a fatal error in judgment. Then we'd better move fast, she said, because I'm not the same woman he bit 2 months ago, and I'm not going to let him hurt innocent people to get to me. The hunt for Sarah was about to begin, and with it, the confrontation that would determine whether his transformation was complete, or whether Adrian's centuries of experience would prove that power alone wasn't enough to challenge a true vampire king. But as prepared for what might be her final battle, she felt something she had never experienced before: complete confidence in her own strength. Whatever happened next, she would face it as herself, not as anyone's victim or property, but as something entirely new in a world that had no rules for what she had become. Finding Adrian's lair proved easier than had expected. Her bond with it heightened her natural intuition to supernatural levels, and she could track Adrian's presence like a bloodhound following a scent. The trail led to an abandoned subway station deep beneath the city, a place that had been closed to the public for decades, but clearly served as Adrian's stronghold. Wanted to bring reinforcements, other vampires who might be willing to challenge Adrian's authority, but refused. This is personal, she told him as they descended into the tunnels. He took Sarah because of me, because he couldn't stand being wrong about my worth. I won't hide behind an army. The subway platform had been transformed into something resembling a medieval throne room. Expensive carpets covered the concrete floor, and elaborate tapestries hung from the tiled walls. Adrian sat on an ornate chair that could only be described as a throne, wearing the same black coat remembered from their first encounter. Sarah knelt beside him, alive but clearly under some form of supernatural compulsion. The little mouse returns, Adrian said as and emerged from the tunnel. And she brings the traitor with her. How deliciously predictable. Stepped forward, nodding how Adrian's red eyes widened slightly as he took in her transformed appearance. She moved with fluid grace now, her posture radiating the confidence that came from finally understanding her own power. Let Sarah go, she said simply. Your fight is with me. Adrian laughed but could hear uncertainty beneath the mockery. My fight is with the vampire who dared to bond with what I had already claimed. You, little mouse, are merely a tool in a larger game. I was never yours to claim, replied, taking another step forward, and I'm not a mouse anymore. She had been practicing with for weeks, learning to harness abilities that pure vampires couldn't possess. Now she let her magical resistance flare outward like a shield, and she had the satisfaction of watching Adrian flinch as her power washed over him. Sarah blinked in confusion as Adrian's mental hold on her wavered. Impossible, Adrian snarled, rising from his throne. No half-blood mongrel has that kind of strength. I'm not half-blood anything, said, her voice carrying newfound authority. I'm something you've never encountered before, which is why you couldn't recognize what you were tasting when you bit me. Adrian moved with vampire speed, crossing the platform in a blur, but was ready for him. Her mixed heritage allowed her to match his supernatural quickness while maintaining the unpredictability that came from her human origins. She dodged his attack and countered with a strike that sent him stumbling backward. Has taught you parlor tricks, Adrian sneered, but could see genuine surprise in his eyes. You're still nothing but a weak human playing dress-up. Smiled, feeling power coursing through her veins like liquid fire. Let me show you exactly what I am. The fight that followed was unlike anything had imagined possible. Adrian was faster and stronger than any opponent she could have faced as a human, but her bond with had given her abilities that pure vampires couldn't understand or counter. She could anticipate his moves through a combination of enhanced reflexes and the natural intuition her grandmother had called the sight. More importantly, discovered that her magical resistance worked both ways. She couldn't be controlled by vampire powers, but she could also disrupt them in others. When Adrian tried to use his supernatural strength to overwhelm her, pushed back with her own power and watched his enhanced abilities falter. "What are you?" Adrian gasped as landed a blow that cracked his ribs. For the first time in their encounters, he sounded genuinely afraid. "I'm what happens when you dismiss someone without understanding what they really are," replied, pressing her advantage. "I'm the mistake you made when you let your arrogance blind you to true power." Adrian, fighting with the desperation of a predator who suddenly found himself prey, but had advantages beyond supernatural strength. She fought with the discipline had taught her, but also with the compassion and creativity that came from her human nature. She could see openings that a pure vampire would miss, could think of strategies that centuries of undead existence would never suggest. The turning point came when Adrian tried to use Sarah as a shield, grabbing the compelled woman and threatening to drain her dry if didn't surrender. It was a classic vampire tactic, using human attachments as weapons, but had learned something important during her transformation. Sometimes the greatest strength came not from fighting, but from understanding. Instead of attacking Adrian directly, reached out to Sarah with her enhanced empathy, the same ability that had made her such a gifted nurse. She could sense her friend's terror beneath the supernatural compulsion, could feel the way Adrian's mental control was hurting Sarah's mind. "I can free her," said quietly, not to Adrian but to Sarah herself. "You just have to trust me." Had never tried anything like what she attempted next. Using her bond with as a template, she reached out with her own power, not to dominate Sarah's mind but to shield it. Her magical resistance expanded outward, wrapping around Sarah like a protective cocoon and severing Adrian's control. Sarah collapsed, gasping and free, but alive and unhurt. Adrian stared in disbelief as his most reliable ability failed him completely. "That's impossible," he repeated. "No one can break a vampire's mental hold from the outside." "No vampire can," agreed. "But I'm not just a vampire, am I? I'm something new." The final phase of their battle was brief but decisive. Adrian, robbed of his ability to use compulsion and facing an opponent who could match his physical abilities while using tactics he couldn't predict, found himself overwhelmed for the first time in centuries. Strikes became more precise, more devastating, as she combined supernatural power with human creativity and Roma magical heritage. When Adrian finally fell, defeated but not destroyed, stood over him with a choice to make. Every vampire law would expect her to kill him, to claim his territory and authority as the victor. Stepped forward, clearly prepared to finish Adrian himself if couldn't. But made a different choice, one that surprised everyone in the abandoned station, including herself. "I'm not going to kill you," she told Adrian as he struggled to rise. "But your reign in this territory is over. You're going to leave tonight, and you're never going to threaten me or anyone I care about again." Adrian's red eyes blazed with humiliation and rage. "You think mercy makes you strong? You think showing weakness to your enemies will protect you?" Crouched beside him, close enough that he could see the supernatural fire burning in her eyes, the power that he had dismissed as worthless. "I think understanding the difference between strength and cruelty is what separated us from the beginning," she said. "You see everything as a contest of dominance, but real power doesn't need to prove itself through violence." She stood and helped Sarah to her feet, nodding with relief that her friend seemed physically unharmed despite her ordeal. "You have until sunrise to leave the city," told Adrian. "If I sense your presence here after that, mercy won't be an option." Adrian struggled to his feet, his expensive coat torn and his aristocratic features twisted with defeat. "This isn't over," he snarled. "There are others like me, others who won't accept a mongrel's authority." "Then they can learn the same lesson you did," replied calmly. "The world is changing, Adrian. Creatures like you who think power only comes from fear and domination are going to find themselves obsolete." After Adrian limped away into the tunnels, approached with an expression of mixed admiration and concern. "You know he was right about one thing," he said quietly. "There will be others who challenge what we've done here. Bonding with a human, even one of your unique heritage, breaks centuries of vampire law." Nodded, helping Sarah toward the exit. Her friend was still dazed but recovering quickly, and could sense that Sarah's memories of the experience would fade to something resembling a nightmare rather than clear recollection. That was probably for the best. "Let them come," said. "I'm not interested in ruling vampire society or changing their laws. I just want to be left alone to figure out what I am and what I can do with these abilities." Smiled, "I don't think they'll leave you alone. What you are, what we've created together, it represents something that threatens the entire supernatural power structure. You're proof that the old hierarchies don't have to be permanent." Considered this as they emerged from the subway tunnels into the pre-dawn darkness. She had started this journey as a frightened human who had been attacked and dismissed by a creature she didn't understand. Now she was something entirely new, with abilities that the categories that supernatural society used to define itself. More importantly, she had discovered that true strength didn't come from abandoning her humanity, but from integrating it with her supernatural gifts. She was more compassionate now, not less. More connected to life and hope, not more focused on death and domination. Over the following months, her reputation spread throughout the supernatural community. Some creatures sought her out for help, drawn by her unique ability to bridge the gap between human and supernatural worlds. Others came looking for a fight, convinced that her mixed nature made her an abomination that needed to be destroyed. Handled each situation according to her own moral compass, not the ancient laws that governed vampire society. She helped where she could, fought when she had to, and gradually built a network of allies who shared her vision of a supernatural world that didn't prey on humanity but coexisted with it. Remained her partner and closest advisor, but their bond had evolved beyond the original magical connection. They had become genuine friends and equals, each bringing unique strengths to their shared mission of creating something better than what had existed before. Sarah never fully remembered what had happened to her in Adrian's lair, but she noticed the changes in and gradually accepted that her friend had somehow become involved in something extraordinary. She never asked for details, but she provided with an anchor to her human life and values that proved invaluable as navigated her new existence. Adrian disappeared from the Eastern Territories as promised, but occasionally heard reports of his activities in distant cities. He seemed to be gathering allies of his own, creatures who shared his contempt for any challenge to traditional supernatural hierarchies. Suspected their paths would cross again someday, but she wasn't afraid of that eventual confrontation. She had learned something important about power during her transformation. True strength came not from dominating others, but from becoming the best version of yourself. Adrian would never understand that lesson, which was why he would ultimately fail in any attempt to reclaim what he had lost. Continued working at the hospital, using her enhanced abilities to help her patients in ways that seemed miraculous to her colleagues. She could sense illness and injury with supernatural accuracy, could provide comfort and healing that went beyond anything medical science could explain. Her supervisors began assigning her to the most difficult cases, the patients that others had given up on, and success rate became legendary among the hospital staff. In quiet moments, reflected on how completely her life had changed since that night in the warehouse district. She had been transformed from a victim into something powerful and unique, but the real change hadn't been in her supernatural abilities. The real transformation had been in understanding her own worth, in refusing to accept someone else's judgment of her value. Adrian had tasted her blood and found it wanting because he couldn't recognize strength that didn't look like his own. He had dismissed her as worthless because her power came from compassion rather than cruelty, from connection rather than domination. That dismissal had been the greatest gift he could have given her, because it had forced her to discover who she really was beneath his contempt. Martinez was no longer the frightened nurse who had walked home through dark alleys hopping to avoid trouble. She was something new in a world that desperately needed new possibilities, a bridge between human and supernatural that offered hope for a better future for both species. And if creatures like Adrian couldn't accept that future, was ready to show them that the old ways of power and dominance were no longer the only options. She had become living proof that strength could come from integration rather than separation, from mercy rather than cruelty, from understanding rather than fear. The Vampire King had tasted her blood and deemed her unworthy, but his enemy had bonded with her and helped her discover that worthiness was something she defined for herself. Everything had shifted, just as the title promised, but not in the way that anyone could have predicted.